Ronald Mizen is the economics correspondent at the Australian Financial Review and joins me now. Just first of all, on that broad claim from Jim Chalmers, he will flesh this out, he says, at some point, but can he be telling the truth here? You know, well, the budget was in a much worse shape than we thought it was.
Well, we're supposed to have this charter of budget honesty introduced by, Peter Costello back in the 90s, which, is supposed to set it up so that governments can't come into power and then all of a sudden realise that there are these significant unknown expenditures or black holes.
But the government's cooked the books, we'll have to change everything now.
Exactly. But, look, as with everything in politics, there's always a way around honesty, right? So there are absolutely spending pressures that we can see on the horizon that perhaps haven't been incorporated into the budget that Labor is going to have to deal with.
Right. So, and we'll get to them. If we think of the very broad measure of spending here, because revenues back up to sort of pre-COVID levels. Revenue's not actually the problem, it's spending. It was about 24.5% of GDP pre-COVID. It's now at 27% and just inching down ever so slowly. That's a huge difference. We're talking here $40, $50, $60 billion of structural deficit. What happened before pre and post? What's fundamentally changed?
Well, there has been a significant increase in spending in areas like health. We've seen the government actuary suggest that the NDIS is continuing to increase and potentially $60 billion over the decade, although I see that the new Minister, Bill Shorten, has rubbished that today. We've also seen the increase in defence spending. It was particularly in the mid-year update around December last year that the government sort of had this significant improvement in the budget bottom line, largely because of commodities and the falling unemployment rate, and they took that opportunity to actually inlay a lot more expenditure in the budget, which they knew was coming down the track.
So at some point they knew they'd have to tip in billions more in the NDIS, in defence projects and so on, but they'd been keeping it off the books, and then once that improved revenue came in, they put all that in.
It's difficult to sort of know where the pressures came in and whether they were pushed back or whatnot. But I mean, for example, in the health space, if we think about what pressures are coming up, we know that the state and territory premiers, when they meet with Anthony Albanese later this month, will be pushing for things like an extension beyond September of the COVID-19 healthcare funding agreement. Now, that's a 50-50 agreement between the Commonwealth and the states. In the most recent budget, that quarter between July and September has been allocated about $1 billion. The other thing they're going to be pushing...
So another $4 billion a year straight away for however long that, if they do get that agreement, for example.
Depending on how COVID plays out over that period. But I mean, the other big one is the increase that they're pushing for in the hospital funding agreement to go from 45% to 50%. Now, they want that to be staggered, so it's not straight away. But that's billions and billions of dollars that is potentially coming down the pipeline that wouldn't have necessarily been...
And that's on top of where we are now with this huge spending.
That's right. And the other, there are other big pressures here. We look at the debt interest payment. We've got basically by the middle of the decade, we expect the interest payments, annual interest payments on the debt that we have, would be about more than $1 trillion, to be $26 billion a year. Now, I don't want to get into too much detail here, but that's based on a certain percentage of government borrowing cost, a bond rate of about 2.3%. The 10-year bond rate is already above 3%. So we're going to see potentially billions and billions of dollars more just to pay for our debt. Now, between the budget and between the PFO, the independent statement in the budget, there was an additional $13 billion just in the cost of our debt.
Just because of the forecasts, well, interest rates are increasing, but also the forecast on them. Once they begin to move, or there's even talk of them moving, that cost of debt goes up straight away.
Yeah, well, if you take the 10-year bond rate, which is sort of the thing that the government uses as an indicator of the cost of borrowing for government, that is already well above where the budget assumed. Now, in the next, I think, 18 months alone, the government's got to refinance about $160 billion of its debt. All the old books thought, well, we're going to refinance that at a much lower rate than what they're actually going to be able to do it. And so that's going to come at a cost.
So if we just look at this broadly to finish on then, we've got structural deficit clearly in the budget now because that spending, I said, is the thing that's gone up. What are Labor's options here? Because presumably at some point they need to address this, not even necessarily if they get it all the way down to zero, but it has to be reined in. Otherwise, things such as AAA credit ratings will come under risk, and that's when you really get a balloon in debt costs.
Yeah, so, look, I think Labor Treasurer Jim Chalmers, coming into his new portfolio, has tried to reset the narrative on this. You know, within his first press conference coming out, he labelled it dire, said that the government had inherited a terrible set of books, really kind of downplayed. It was a distinctive shift that we've heard in tone between the previous government and this government about the budget situation. Now, Labor talked about wanting to cut rorts and waste. And you know, they talk about things like the JobKeeper payments going to companies that increase their revenues. They talk about the submarine costs of scrapping the contract, but they're sunk costs. They're not going to be able to
they're done.
Back.
You can say bad decision on it, but you're not going to get a cent out of it.
Exactly. And I don't think you're going to be able to get the scope of savings from simply doing an audit of rorts and waste, however you define it.
Community grants, sports grants, all that. You might save a few billion over 10 years, that's it.
Yeah, exactly. And look, we're having huge revenue windfalls from commodity prices, no doubt about that.
All right.
But whether that'll be enough doesn't sound like it, according to the Treasurer.
Maybe they could even tap into it with a PRRT change. That might be a discussion for another day. Ron Mizen, thanks for your time.